The brothel window she looked out for 11 years. A Lakota chief bought the whole building. I'll tell you about the window first. It faced east. That's the only reason I know she kept something alive in there. A woman who's given up doesn't care which way she looks. She looked east every morning. I was told this by a half-crow trader named Bissett who'd passed through Holt twice and remembered her face at the glass because it didn't match the place. He said her eyes were on the hills, not the street. That's what he said. Eyes on the hills. I didn't go to Holt for her. I want to be clear about that, because men who tell stories like this tend to dress themselves up in the telling. I went to Holt because I had horses to sell, and a debt to collect from a man named Aldous Frick, who ran a dry goods operation on the south end of the main road, and had owed my brother's widow $11.40 for going on 3 years. That's the whole of why I rode into Holt on a Tuesday in late October, the kind of day where the sky presses down flat and gray like a stone over a well. I was 53 years old. My hair had gone white at the temples. I rode a blue roan named Carrier, which is not a romantic name for a horse, but he earned it by carrying things without complaint, which I respected. My name is Hunt's Walking, though the whites in the territory had taken to calling me Samuel, which I allowed because it cost me nothing and saved time. My father's father had been a war chief. My father had been a farmer and a treaty man, which cost him everything, including eventually his life, though not quickly. I had spent my years trying to be something that didn't fit either of those shapes cleanly, and I had arrived at 53 with enough land, enough horses, a reputation in 3 counties that kept most trouble at a distance, and a quiet that sometimes felt like peace and sometimes felt like an empty room. My wife had died 4 years before, fever. 3 days and then she was gone, and I had learned in those 4 years since that grief doesn't leave. It just moves to a smaller room in you and shuts the door, and some days you can walk past that door all day without hearing anything, and some days it opens on its own and you stand there. That is the man who rode into Holt. Bissett had told me about her without meaning to. We'd been talking about the territory, trails, weather, which towns had gone mean, and he mentioned Holt as a place that had gotten meaner than most, and he mentioned the brothel as the cause of some of that, and he mentioned her in the way a man mentioned something that bothered him, and he never found a place to put it. Said there was a woman there, white woman originally, taken from a homestead south of the Niobrara about 11 years back, passed through 3 different sets of hands before ending up at this place, and the woman who ran the establishment was named Girk, just Girk. No first name anyone used, and Girk had a way of keeping women that didn't involve locks on every door, which was the part Bissett found hard to explain. He said she looked like someone who knew exactly where she was and had no idea how to be anywhere else. He said it like he'd been carrying the image a long time. I didn't say much. I filed it away the way you file away something that has no immediate use. That was August. By October, riding into Holt with Carrier's shoes ringing on the frozen road and the smell of coal smoke sitting low over the buildings, I had the image back. Window facing east, eyes on the hills. I sold the horses first. Then I found Aldous Frick, who was a red-faced man with the kind of bluster that sits on top of shame, and after 10 minutes of conversation, he paid the $11.40 with the particular speed of a man who wants a large thing to be over quickly. Then I had a meal at a place near the livery that had decent beans and terrible coffee, and I sat there for longer than the food required, and I thought about the window. I am not a man who acts on feeling. I want to be clear about that too. I act on what I know and what I can do and what the situation requires. What I knew was this. A woman was being held in a condition that was, at its root, a form of taking. I knew about taking. My people had had things taken from us in ways that still showed in the land itself, in the absences where things had been. A woman taken from her life and held in a building while years went by. I understood that in a way I didn't need to examine. What I could do was what I had always been able to do. I could bring resources to bear. I had money from the horses. I had more at home. I had, over 20 years of careful dealing, accumulated enough of a reputation in the territory that men thought twice before they decided to be stupid in my presence. What the situation required was something I'd have to determine when I got there. I left a coin on the table and walked out into the cold. The place Bissett had described was a 2-story frame building on the north end of town, painted a color that had once been yellow and was now the color of an old bruise. There was a sign above the door that said rooms in letters that had been repainted recently, which struck me as the kind of detail that tells you something about the person who runs a place, that she kept the sign fresh while the building decayed around it, that she cared about the invitation more than the interior. I didn't go in, not then. I stood across the road in the shadow of a wagon shed and I looked at the building for a while. 11 years. I thought about what 11 years in a place does to a person. I thought about the shape a life takes when the walls are always the same walls, and the window is the one thing that changes, just the light through it, morning to evening, season to season, for 11 years. There was a window on the second floor, east side. There was no one at it. I went to find out who held the paper on the building. That took most of the rest of the day. The building was owned by a man in Omaha who had lent money to the previous owner and taken the property when the loan went bad, and Girk was a tenant, which meant I didn't have to deal with Girk at all, which was a piece of good fortune I hadn't counted on. The local man who handled the Omaha owner's affairs in Holt was a lawyer named Peel. He had an office above the hardware store and an expression of permanent mild alarm, as if everything that came through his door surprised him slightly. I told him I was interested in the property on the north end. He said it was occupied. I said I understood that and asked what the owner wanted for it. He told me. I said I'd give him that. He blinked. I said I'd need the transaction completed by the following morning and I'd pay an additional $30 for the speed. He blinked again. Then he picked up his pen. I left a deposit. I told him to say nothing to the current occupant until the papers were signed in the morning. He had the look of a man who had just understood something about what was happening that he didn't want to be responsible for, and I said, "This is a legal property transaction, Mr. Peel." He nodded. He kept nodding. I slept that night in the livery, rolled in my blankets next to Carrier, which I had done 1,000 times and found more reliable than most hotel arrangements. I lay on my back and looked at the dark ceiling and thought about how I would handle the morning. I had handled things before. I had stood between people and what was being done to them, and I knew that the difference between something going clean and something going bloody was almost always speed and certainty. No hesitation, no negotiation once the line is drawn. Know what you're going to say before you open your mouth. I went asleep before midnight, which is something I've always been able to do, and which I think is among the more useful things a man can be capable of. Peel had the papers ready at 7. His hand was slightly unsteady when he handed them to me, which told me he'd spent part of the night thinking about what he was part of. I signed. I paid, he said. I hope you know what you're doing. I said, I own a building. He looked at the floor. I walked to the north end with the deed folded in my coat pocket and Carrier at my side on a lead, because I had found over the years that a horse beside you changes the geometry of a confrontation in ways that are hard to define but consistently useful. I knocked on the door of the yellow building at 7:40 in the morning. The woman who answered was Girk. She was perhaps 60, broad across the shoulders, with eyes that had probably been calculating since childhood. She looked at me and then at Carrier and then at me again. I said, "Good morning. I own this building. I'm here to take possession." She stared at me for a long time. Then she said, "You're out of your mind." I took the deed from my pocket and held it out. She didn't take it. I said, "You have until this evening to collect your belongings and vacate. Anyone else in the building has the same." She said a number of things then. I won't repeat them. She was angry in the way people are angry when they've lived a long time inside an arrangement they thought was permanent, and the arrangement has suddenly ended, and they haven't had time yet to understand that the ending doesn't require their agreement. I let her finish. I didn't move and I didn't raise my voice, and I kept my face still, which is something I'd learned from my grandfather, who could make a man feel the ground shifting under him without saying a word. When she was done, I said, "I'll be back at 4 o'clock, please be gone." I walked across the road with Carrier and stood in the shadow of the wagon shed again. I should tell you something about what I expected, or rather what I didn't. I didn't expect anything in particular. I had come here to do a thing that needed doing, and the woman at the window was the reason, but I had no picture in my mind of how it would go once the building was mine. I had learned not to build pictures like that. The world has a way of being very different from the picture. What I expected, practically speaking, was that most of the women in the building would scatter when Girk told them what had happened, which is what frightened people do when the structure holding them in place suddenly falls. Some might not know where to go, and I had arranged with the woman who ran the boarding house on the south end, a solid, no-nonsense bohemian widow named Dvorak, to take in anyone who needed a bed for a few nights at my expense. That much I had worked out. I hadn't worked out the rest, because the rest depended on what I found. At 4 o'clock I went back. The building was half emptied. Girk was gone. 2 younger women were still in the front room with their things piled up, looking frightened, and I told them about Dvorak's place and gave them each enough money to get there and get a meal. They left. I didn't ask their names or their stories. That wasn't my role in what was happening to them, and I understood that. I went upstairs. The east side room was the third door on the left. I knocked. Silence. I said, "My name is Hunt's Walking. I own this building now. You don't have to go anywhere you don't want to, but I'd like to speak with you if you're willing." A long pause. Then a voice said, "What language are you speaking?" I said, "English." Another pause. Then, "What else do you speak?" I said, "Lakota, some Crow, some Spanish." Silence again. Then she said something in Lakota. Not fluent, but real, the words carried right, which meant she'd learned them from someone who spoke the language, not from a trader's phrase list. She said, "Is the woman downstairs gone?" I said yes in Lakota. I heard something move in the room. Then the door opened. Her name was Marin. I found that out later. At the time she didn't give it. She was perhaps 40, though she looked both older and younger than that in different ways. Her face had the particular set of someone who has controlled every expression for so long that the control itself had become the expression, and underneath it you could see something that hadn't been worn all the way down. Her hair was brown and braided, which I noticed because it was the practical choice of someone who had learned to minimize what other people could take hold of. She was thin. Her hands, when I saw them, had the roughness of someone made to work at things she hadn't chosen. She looked at me for a long time without saying anything. I let her. I stood in the hallway and I didn't step toward her, and I kept my hands still and open at my sides. Then she said, in Lakota, slower this time and watching my face to see if I tracked it, "How long have you known I was here?" I said, "A few months. I came for other reasons. I didn't come for you specifically. I want to be honest about that." She considered that. She said, "Most men lie about what they came for." I said, "I know, that's why I told you." She looked at me. The window behind her was going gold with late afternoon light. I could see the hills in the glass behind her head, the line of them, and I understood then what Bissett had meant. She said, "What happens to me now?" I said, "That depends on what you want." She said, "I haven't been asked that in 11 years. I didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say that wouldn't make it smaller. I'll tell you what I knew about the Lakota she spoke. She'd learned it from a family she'd been with for 2 years before being passed along, learned it the way children learn things they need to survive, thoroughly, without thinking of it as learning. She'd kept it because it was hers in a way nothing else had been allowed to be. A woman who keeps a language for 11 years in that building, keeps it sharp and private, doesn't lose the words, that tells you something about what's still intact in her. I had a camp 2 miles east of town because I never stayed in a town overnight if I had a choice, and I had a fire and food and enough supplies for the week it would take me to get home. I told her this. I told her I was going east in the morning. I told her she could come as far as she wanted or stop wherever she wanted, and I would provide horses and food and whatever else she needed for the journey, and at the end of it she could decide what she did next. She said why. Not suspiciously, just plainly, a woman who had learned to track a man's actual motives rather than his stated ones. I said because I am able to, because it needed doing. Those are the only 2 reasons I've ever needed. She looked at me for a long time. Then she went back into the room and came out with a bundle that couldn't have weighed more than 15 pounds, which is what 11 years of being held somewhere does to what you accumulate. It either disappears or you never let yourself have it in the first place, because having things means you have something to lose, and she had already learned what that felt like. We walked out of the building together. I pulled the door shut behind us. I didn't lock it. It wasn't my concern anymore in that way, and I wasn't going to keep anything locked that day. I had a second horse at the camp. I had brought her for the return trip because I'd known I might be selling more horses than I planned, and there is always a reason to have an extra horse if you're far from home. Her name was Dusk, which is the kind of name that happens when you name a horse at the end of a long day. Gray-dun, even-tempered, easy-gaited. Marin looked at her for a moment and then put her hand on the horse's jaw the way you do when you've been around horses, not tentative, not cautious, just a greeting. That told me something too. We ate by the fire. I didn't ask her about the 11 years. She didn't offer it. We talked about the road east landmarks, water, where the ground was reliable and where it wasn't. She listened the way someone listens when information is actual information, not conversation to fill time. Practical. She asked 2 or 3 sharp questions that told me she'd been moving across the land before she was taken, that she knew how to navigate. At some point I said, "You don't have to explain anything to me. Not now, not later. Nothing is owed." She said, "I know. I'm working out what to say anyway." I said, "Take all the time you need." She said, "It's been a long time since anyone said that to me." I put more wood on the fire. The stars were sharp and cold overhead, the kind of night that makes the sky feel close, like a ceiling, but a high one. Carrier was tied nearby and Dusk was beside him, and the sound of the horses moving occasionally in the dark was, as it always is, the most settling sound I know. We rode east for 6 days. I won't tell you we talked the whole way, because that would be the kind of thing that sounds true in a story but isn't true in life. We were quiet a lot. Long stretches of riding with just the sound of the horses and the land, and the particular silence that builds between 2 people who are each working something out separately, but in the same direction. She told me things in pieces, not the 11 years, those she kept to herself mostly, and I honored that. The years before, she'd come west with her family as a girl, her father a carpenter with eyes bigger than his means, her mother a woman who could work harder than 3 men and still read aloud at night from the books she'd carried in a box from Ohio. She'd grown up knowing the land, knowing it the way you know something you've had to pay attention to in order to survive it, which is a more honest knowing than the way people who have never been in danger of it talk about the wilderness. She talked about her mother's reading, more than once. I think those nights with the lamplight and the books were what she'd been keeping most carefully. I told her about my wife. That surprised her. I could see it in her face that I would offer that. I said, 4 years ago, fever. She said, "I'm sorry." Plain and direct, no performance in it, which is the only kind of condolence that means anything. I told her about the land I had, the house, the pasture, the horses. Not boasting, just describing, the way you describe something to someone who might need to picture it. She listened. On the fourth night she said, "The Lakota I learned, is it right? I mean the actual speaking of it." I said, "Mostly. Your grammar is a generation old. You learned it from someone who was probably older." She said he was. He was an old man. He taught me because I asked. I said, "Why did you ask?" She said, "Because it was mine if I learned it. Nobody could take it." I thought about that for a while. I said, "Yes, that's exactly right." The morning of the sixth day we came up over a long rise, and below us was the valley where I kept my land. And the house was there in the morning light, which at that time of year in that place is a low amber light that comes sideways across the grass and makes everything look like the land itself is paying attention. Marin pulled Dusk to a stop at the top of the rise. She sat there looking down for a long moment. She said, "This is yours." I said, "Yes." She said, "All of it?" I said, "To the creek line to the south and the ridge to the north. About 400 acres. Another silence, long enough that I wasn't sure what was coming. Then she said quietly in Lakota, "You are a man of substance." It's a phrase in the language that carries more than the words. It doesn't mean money or land. It means a man whose presence accounts for something. A man the ground recognizes. It's what you say about a chief, about a man of his word, about a man who has used what he had well and stands inside his own life without apology. The old word for it is not easy to translate because English doesn't quite have the shape of it, but she had it right. She had the pronunciation exactly right, which after 11 years of not speaking it aloud to anyone who knew the language, that was something. I didn't say anything for a moment. Then I said, "Come down and I'll show you. There is a room in the house, east-facing. I want to tell you that before I tell you anything else about what came after, because it matters. When I built the house, 8 years before, I put the largest window on the east wall, in the main room, because I had always preferred morning light to evening light, and I saw no reason to compromise on it. It faces the ridge. In the early morning you get the light coming over the ridge line, and it fills that room in a way that the rest of the house doesn't get, and I had always been glad of it, just for myself, just as a thing to start the day inside. I showed her the room. She stood at the window. The light was doing what it does. She stood there longer than you stand somewhere you're just looking at. I didn't say anything. I gave her the silence. Some things need room to become whatever they're going to become, and you can't rush that or manage it. You can only step back and let it happen. After a while she turned around. She said, "I'd like to stay, if that's something you'd allow." I said, "It's not about allowing." She said, "Then I'd like to stay." I said, "Then stay." That winter was cold and long and fine. She earned her own shape in the house quickly, the way people do when they finally have room to take up their actual amount of space. She was capable in ways that kept appearing, with the horses, with the stores, with the repairs that needed doing after the first hard freeze hit. She had grown up practical, and she had spent 11 years being used as a practical person in the way of all the work that surrounds that kind of establishment. And what that meant was that her hands knew things, her judgment knew things, and she had no patience for doing anything inefficiently, which I found immediately and completely congenial. We learned each other the way two people learn each other when both of them have been alone long enough to know the value of quiet slowly, without pressure, each piece earned. She told me more of the before years and I told her more of mine, evenings by the fire, not every evening, whenever the shape of the night invited it. The Lakota she spoke got sharper by March. I can't say I set out to teach her, but I corrected things when they were off, and she received the corrections the way good students do, which is without ego and with genuine interest. And by spring, she was speaking it better than most white people who'd lived their whole lives in the territory ever managed. In April, 2 men from the town I'd passed through on the way back, Draven's Crossing, about 40 miles west, came to ask me about a dispute over water rights that they'd had festering for 2 seasons and couldn't resolve. This was not unusual. I had, over the years, become someone people came to when the regular mechanisms had broken down, partly because I had no stake in most of the conflicts, and partly because I had a reputation for saying what I thought without embroidery. Marin was in the house. I brought the men inside because the wind was up and it was no day to stand outside, and she brought coffee and set it down without comment and didn't leave the room, just went on with what she was doing, which happened to be mending one of the bridles in the corner. The two men noticed her. Men always noticed her, not in the way you might imagine, but in the way they notice a person in a room who carries more authority than they expected. She had that, even quietly, particularly quietly. I settled the water dispute in about 20 minutes, which I knew going in I would be able to do because it was the kind of dispute that persists not because the solution is complicated, but because neither party wants to be the one to propose the reasonable thing first. I proposed it. Both men agreed. They were relieved in the way people are relieved when someone removes a thing from their hands that they've been holding too long. After they left, Marin said, "You did that well." I said it wasn't complicated. She said, "I don't mean the water. I mean the way you sat in the room. The way you let them be the ones to talk. You gave them the answer without making them feel smaller than it." I looked at her. She said, "That takes a particular kind of man." She said it the way she said things, level, no decoration on it, not flattery, observation. I had learned by then that she was constitutionally incapable of saying something she didn't mean, which was one of the things about her that felt most like solid ground. By summer the news had gotten around, the way news does in a territory where people move slow and talk reaches far. What had been done in Holt, a Lakota man buying that building, walking a woman out of it, that kind of thing travels. Some people told it one way. Some people told it another. The versions where I came off badly were mostly from men who had arrangements similar to the one in Holt and didn't care to think too carefully about what the story implied about those arrangements. The version that eventually settled as the one most people told was this: that there was a man on the East Valley land who saw something that needed doing and did it, and the woman he'd brought home was worth knowing, and together they were the kind of pair that people brought their real problems to. Which is roughly accurate, as versions go. I am not going to tell you it was without difficulty. Difficulty came in forms I expected and some I didn't. There were people who wanted her to be smaller than she was, who wanted her to fit inside the story they'd already decided on. She didn't fit. She never tried to. She had spent 11 years being made to fit into spaces not of her choosing, and she had no more patience for it. And I found that I had no patience for anyone who asked it of her, which surprised me a little because I had learned over 53 years to keep my peace with most things. But there are limits. A man who has stood in a particular doorway long enough knows what he will and won't let through it. There is a thing that happened in September I want to tell you because it is the thing I come back to most often, not because it was dramatic, but because it was the moment I knew something that I had not known precisely before, even though I had been living alongside it all summer. We had ridden out to the south fence to look at a section of post that had been damaged by a downed tree in the previous week's storm. The damage was not serious, a few posts down, a stretch of wire that needed restringing, a half-day's work. We'd tied the horses and were walking the line, and I was assessing what we'd need when she stopped. I looked at where she was looking. There was nothing there. A prairie dog sitting up at the edge of his hole watching us. The sky above the ridge, which had gone that deep blue it goes in September, the blue that doesn't happen in any other month. The grass moving. She said, "Do you know what I thought about most, in that room?" I said nothing, I waited. She said, "I thought about the color the grass gets in the fall. Not because it's beautiful, though it is, but because it's the one thing I knew was still happening out there every September without me. The grass going gold, the hills doing that. I used to think if I could just see that just once more, I'd make it until next year." She paused. She said, "It's a strange thing to be kept alive by." I said, "No, it's not." I looked at the grass, the color it was, September in that valley. She looked at me, not at the grass, at me. I knew what was in her face, because by then I knew her face the way you come to know the particular weather of a place you've lived a long time. The thing she looked like when she was about to say something she hadn't allowed herself to say before. She put her hand on my arm. Not a grip, not a hold. Just her hand there on the sleeve of my coat, the way you put your hand on something solid to feel that it's solid. She said, "I'm glad you rode into that town." I looked at her hand on my arm. I said, "So am I." She didn't move her hand. We stood there for a while, the horses shifting behind us, the prairie dog abandoning his post and disappearing, the September sky doing what September skies do, which is make you feel that you are inside something that is almost too large to stand inside, but you can, if you have someone standing there with you. I am not going to tell you everything that came after. Some of it is mine and hers and nobody else's business, which is as it should be. I'll tell you this, she stayed. Not because she had nowhere else to go, she had places she could have gone by that point and she knew it, and I knew she knew it. She stayed because she chose to, and she was the kind of woman who did not make choices for the wrong reasons, which means when she made one, you could trust it all the way down. That is the whole of it. A man who has enough to do a thing, who sees a thing that needs doing and does it. A woman who kept herself intact through 11 years of a situation that would have undone most people, and who gave her trust to the man she thought was worth giving it to freely on her own terms, after she'd had time to decide. I am 58 now. My hair is white all the way through. The land is what it always was, and the horses are what they always are, and Carrier died last spring at 22 years old, which is a long life for a horse, and he spent it well. Most mornings I come into the east room before Marin is up, and I stand at that window for a while. The light comes over the ridge. The valley does what it does. It is very quiet at that hour, and quiet has been my oldest companion, and I know the difference now between the kind that is an empty room and the kind that is a full one. She comes in eventually. She usually doesn't say anything. She stands beside me and we look at the light. The grass in September is gold.